Rancher lived alone for years. Until 7. Beautiful widows came seeking shelter in Wild West stories. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Out on the prairie, where the wind cuts sharp and loneliness runs deep, a rancher had lived alone for 8 long years. Each night, he lit a lantern, not for company, but out of habit. Then one stormy night, 7 widows rode into that light, and when he opened his door, nothing was ever the same again. Every night he lit a lantern on his porch, though no soul had passed his way in years. Elias Crow lived out on the edge of the prairie like a shadow stretched too long. His cabin was 3 rooms of weathered pine, standing stubborn against wind and sky, 4 sides open to nothing but sagebrush and grass that turned gray in summer. Beyond it, the horizon just kept pulling back, mile after mile, as if daring a man to chase it. Every evening moved the same. He'd clean out the horse trough, sweep the dust from the barn door, and run a brush through the mane of Lark, the oldest gelding left from the years when he still had company. His hands knew the work without thought, like they knew the veins and scars along his own wrist. Inside, a pot of beans and bacon simmered slow on the stove. The smell wasn't rich, it was steady, the way a clock is steady. Elias ate sparingly, broke a chunk of cornbread, swallowed down a swallow of coffee, and set his cup back in the exact ring it had carved into the wood of his table. He no longer marked time by the busted wall clock, but by the voice of the wind. Out here, the wind sang different at dusk, low, drawn out, carrying the groan of the porch boards like a memory you couldn't quite name. Before he closed up for the night, he lit the lantern. It was an old tin thing, scarred with rust, glass clouded by years of grit. But each evening, he trimmed the wick, filled it with oil, and hung it high on the porch hook. Out there in the empty miles, the glow would show itself as a pinprick against the dark, hardly more than a firefly. No rider had come this way in years, not one soul to notice. Still, Elias lit it. He didn't call it kindness. He just knew he could breathe easier when the porch carried light. Night on the prairie was a different country. Coyotes sang out, their cries slipping like knives through the grass. Even a moth's wings at the lantern glass sounded loud, insistent. Sometimes Elias sat on the steps with his boots planted together, running a thumb across the cracked stem of his pipe, watching that small flame hold its ground against the dark. He didn't think much. He let his eyes rest where they could, on something sure and steady. The wind carried memories, same as it carried dust. Once in a while, Elias caught laughter in it, the thin laughter of a woman long gone, the quick scamper of a child's bare feet on those very porch boards. The sounds came soft, far off, like ghosts not quite willing to leave. He never chased them. Memory was all he had left to guard. Inside, his Winchester still rested on the mantel. He hadn't fired it in years, but his hands kept it clean, his ear still listening for the hollow ring of the chamber. Habit was loyalty of a kind, and loyalty had kept him alive when nothing else had. Across from his chair, the other rocker stayed empty. Not for anyone in particular, just space left open, the way a fire leaves room for air. Sometimes Elias poured a second cup, setting it on the table without a word. He didn't pretend anyone would drink it. He just liked the way it filled the silence. Out on the porch, the lantern held fast, casting a thin gold arc across the boards. To a stranger, if there had been one, it would have been no more than a tired spark, easy to miss against the wide black sky. But Elias believed, still, in some quiet place of him, that someone out there, lost or bone-weary, might see it and find a reason to keep walking. That night the clouds dragged low, heavy with rain. Before he bolted the door, Elias looked once more at the lantern swaying against the wind. Its light marked his face, catching in his eyes like a prayer he'd never bothered to speak aloud. The cabin breathed with the groan of timber and the hiss of dying coals. A half cup of coffee cooled on the table. At his age, there wasn't much left to want. A man lived by small acts, the brushing of a horse, the folding of a blanket, the trimming of a wick, and sometimes those acts, done steady as the wind, were the very things that kept him from drifting away. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain. Elias shut his eyes, hearing something faint, like hoofbeats far off, or maybe just the pulse of the storm coming closer. He didn't know yet, only that the lantern was lit, the porch held light, and that was enough for anyone lost on the prairie to find their way to his door. Through the roar of the storm came 7 riders, shadows cut against the lightning. The storm rolled in like a wounded beast, dragging its weight across the plains. Wind howled against the rafters, rattling every loose nail in Elias's cabin. Rain came first in drops, then in sheets, slashing sideways as though the sky itself had turned against the earth. Elias stood at the window, cup in his hand, gone cold, watching the last color bleed from the horizon until nothing remained but a gray blur. He'd weathered storms before, blizzards that buried corrals, dust winds that scoured skin raw, but this one carried something different. It pressed on the house as if testing the timbers, as if deciding whether a man had any right to sit warm while the world outside drowned. He listened to it, steady as always, but felt a weight gather in his chest. Then it came, the sound no man on the frontier mistook, hoofbeats. Faint at first, swallowed by the storm, then louder, pounding through the mud like a heartbeat forced too fast. Elias leaned close to the glass. The rain made rivers across the pane, but through it he caught shapes. Dark figures, bending low in their saddles, fighting the gale. Not one, not two, 7 riders. His hand shifted toward the rifle above the hearth, not out of fear, but from old muscle memory. For 8 years, no soul had crossed his land uninvited. The prairie taught him that strangers often carried trouble in their saddlebags, and mercy could cost a man more than his life. Still, he watched. The riders drew closer, their outlines sharp against the flash of lightning, and then he saw skirts whipping in the wind, hair plastered against faces, women, all of them. The storm caught their voices. Scraps of words carried thin across the yard, but not enough to make sense. Elias's breath settled heavy in his chest. 7 women riding through a storm fierce enough to drown cattle. Women with horses too fine for desperation, saddles too well-oiled for poverty. Nothing about it sat right. Yet when the first rider lifted her face to the lantern glow, he saw not banditry, but exhaustion, a kind of bone-deep weariness that went beyond fear. They reined in at his porch, hooves splashing mud against the steps. Elias set down his cup, slow and deliberate, and the house felt suddenly smaller for the sound of rain beating down. He didn't move for the door yet. He stood still, listening, weighing the distance between solitude and whatever waited on the other side of his threshold. The lead woman dismounted, her boots sinking in the muck. She pushed soaked hair from her eyes and looked at the cabin, the way the lost look at fire. Behind her, the others stayed close, huddled in their saddles, shoulders hunched as if the storm were only half the weight they carried. Lightning split the sky. For an instant, the yard shone white, and Elias saw them clear. 7 strangers, every one of them marked by hardship, every one of them standing in the downpour like people who had nowhere left to turn. The wind slammed against the house. Rain spattered through the cracks, and for the first time in years, Elias Crow felt his solitude shift, as if the storm had not just found him, but brought something with it, right to his door. 7 widows begged for shelter, but their eyes held secrets, not sorrow. The pounding on his door wasn't harsh, not the fist of men demanding entry. It was lighter, uncertain, but carried through wood and wind all the same. Elias sat still in his chair, listening, letting the storm answer first. Another knock followed, firmer this time, steady as a plea. He rose, boots heavy on the plank floor. The rifle still hung above the hearth. His hand brushed the stock, but he didn't take it down. Not yet. At the window, the lantern glow reached across the porch and caught the faces gathered there. 7 women, rain dripping from the brims of their hats, dresses clinging dark to their frames. The one in front stood straighter than the rest. Even through the storm, Elias caught the shape of her presence, like someone who had always been obeyed and wasn't used to waiting. Her auburn hair lay plastered across her cheeks, but her chin was lifted, steady against the rain. The others hung back, silent, their eyes lowered. For a moment, Elias thought of shutting the bolt and walking away. 8 years he'd managed with no one crossing that threshold, and the peace, lonely as it was, had held. Letting people in was like letting in the storm itself. Once it found a crack, it never truly left. Another knock, sharper now. He heard the lead woman's voice cut through the downpour. "Sir, please? The night will finish us if you don't open." No desperation in her tone, no breaking, just a fact laid plain, like asking for water at a well. Elias's breath caught in his throat. His father's words rose from years ago. A man's measure is taken by how he treats those with nothing to offer him. But his father had never faced 7 figures in the rain, with eyes that looked as if they carried secrets heavier than the storm. He slid the bolt back. The sound seemed louder than thunder. When he pulled the door open, wind burst in, scattering ash from the hearth and sending his lantern flame reeling. The auburn-haired woman stepped forward first, rainwater dripping from her coat onto his floorboards. She met his gaze without a flinch. "We won't last another mile," she said simply. Behind her, the others waited, not crowding, not speaking, just standing close together, shivering, watching him with eyes that flickered between hope and wariness. Elias held the door wide, saying nothing. They moved past him one by one, like shadows pulled from the storm, until the cabin, that had known only one heartbeat for years, now breathed with 7 more. The door closed against the wind. The storm rattled outside. Inside, silence hung heavier than any words could. And in that silence, Elias Crow felt the balance of his years alone tilt, subtle but certain, as though something greater than the weather had crossed his porch that night. The fire burned warm, yet suspicion made the room colder than the storm outside. The cabin changed the moment they entered. Elias had lived so long with only the scrape of his own boots and the sigh of his chair that even the smallest sound, a wet cloak dropping onto the floor, a muffled cough, the shuffle of skirts, felt loud enough to unsettle the walls. The women gathered near the hearth, stretching hands stiff with cold toward the flames. Steam rose from their sleeves and hair, the smell of wet wool mingling with wood smoke. One of them, tall and dark-haired, bent low to feed a log onto the fire as if she'd done it 100 times before. Another found his tin pot on the stove and poured herself a swallow of coffee without asking. Elias watched every move, saying nothing, his back set firm against the door. The auburn-haired woman, the one who had spoken, slipped off her riding gloves. Even soaked and torn, her dress whispered of money once spent freely. She stood easy, as though her boots belonged on any floor, no matter whose house it was. Her eyes flicked across the cabin, walls, shelves, the mantel where his rifle hung, as though she were tallying it all. Elias crossed to the stove, took up the kettle, and poured black coffee into cups scarred by years of use. He set them down on the table, his motion steady, practiced. No word of welcome, no smile. Only the offer, plain as bread. The women accepted, murmuring thanks so soft they barely stirred the air. Their voices carried honeyed tones, but their eyes never quite softened. From his chair, Elias studied them. 7 strangers huddled in his home, rain running down their boots, firelight throwing their faces into restless shadow. None of them looked broken. Their backs stayed straight, their shoulders squared. They carried themselves less like widows, more like soldiers who'd marched too far. The youngest, her hair the color of wheat, trembled as she lifted the cup. She caught Elias watching and lowered her eyes quickly. Her hands shook, spilling coffee down her knuckles. She dabbed it with the corner of her shawl, pretending calm. The sight caught at Elias's chest. For just a moment he thought of his sister long ago, the way she tried to hide fear with a brave face. He looked away, letting the thoughts settle like dust. The fire crackled. Outside, thunder grumbled across the plains, low and constant. Inside, no one spoke of where they'd come from or where they were bound. The silence between them carried more weight than words. Elias leaned back in his chair, cup warming his palm. He had given them shelter, and in doing so, he had broken the quiet life he'd built board by board. Still, something in him knew. Once a man opens his door, he cannot close it the same way again. The wind rattled the windows as if to agree. Inside that cabin, two walls faced each other, their silence and his suspicion. The storm had settled into its long stride, steady rain pounding the roof as if it meant to wear the boards thin. Inside, the fire threw light across unfamiliar faces. Elias sat with his coffee, the rim of the cup resting against his beard, his eyes watching over the room. The women filled his cabin in a way he hadn't expected, not with noise. None of them spoke more than a few scattered words, but with presence. Their silence pressed as firm as the storm outside. They sat close together, shoulders brushing, eyes seldom lifting to meet his. He had seen men ride into gunfire with less caution than these women showed in the quiet of his kitchen. Elias's hand hovered near the table, never far from the old knife he used for chores. Not because he meant harm, but because habit ran deep. He had worn the badge once, carried the law like a burden, and watched men he trusted turn that law to ash. Since then, he had lived by a simple creed: keep your back to a wall, your hand near iron, and your trust in no one. Across the room, the auburn-haired woman caught his eye. She didn't look away. Her gaze was level, knowing, as if she could read the way his shoulders stayed tense, the way his boots stayed planted firm. Elias met her stare, steady as stone. It was not hostility, not yet, but it was no welcome either. The others shifted beneath the weight of the silence. One traced a finger along the rim of her cup. Another leaned her head against the wall, eyes half closed, as though sleep might claim her if only she dared. The youngest kept her shawl wrapped tight, as though the cold had seeped deeper than bone. Elias drank, slow. The coffee had gone lukewarm, but he swallowed it just the same. He thought of his father again, the man's voice rising from memory. A door once opened is a promise made. His father had meant kindness. Elias had lived long enough to know that promise could cut a man in two. The rain hammered harder. In the spaces between thunder, Elias could hear them breathe. 7 strangers sitting beneath his roof, and not a one willing to tell him what shadow trailed them. Their silence was its own kind of wall, set against his suspicion. And so the room held 2 walls that night. Theirs, built of secrets, his, built of doubt. Between the two, the fire snapped and hissed, carrying sparks up the chimney like messages no one dared to speak. Elias leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. He let the doubt sit with him, heavy but honest. The prairie had taught him this much: danger rarely shouted. Most times, it sat quiet in a corner, waiting for a man to decide whether he'd recognize it before it moved. He didn't reach for his rifle, not yet, but he kept his eyes on the women, the way a man watches the horizon, knowing a storm may have already broken, even if the first drop has yet to fall. The trembling hands of the youngest widow mirrored the face of a sister he had lost. The hours moved slow, measured not by clock hands, but by the crackle of wood turning to embers. Elias sat in his chair, shoulders bent, the weight of watchfulness pressing down. The women lingered in a half circle near the hearth, shadows bending long across the floor. No one asked questions, no one offered answers. The storm outside did enough talking for them all. It was the youngest who finally caught him, her presence quieter than the rest, but trembling at the edges. She couldn't have been more than 20, maybe less, her hair pale as straw after harvest, her face drawn thin from too many miles. She held her tin cup in both hands, and when she lifted it, the liquid sloshed and spilled across her knuckles. Her fingers shook. She tried to hide it, dabbing the spill with her shawl as if the slip had been nothing. But Elias saw. He saw more than a girl with cold hands. He saw another face, from a time long buried. His sister, Clara, years back. Before the fever, before the night she'd been left alone in a town that gave her no mercy. He remembered her small defiance, the way she'd tried to mask fear with a smile that never reached her eyes. The memory slid sharp as glass through him. Elias turned away, jaw tight, yet the echo lingered. Every line of the young woman's trembling hand mirrored the way his sister once gripped the edge of their kitchen table, pretending she wasn't afraid. And in that mirror, Elias's doubt wavered. He had lived 8 years holding suspicion like a shield. Now, for the first time in all those lonely seasons, the shield felt heavy. He wondered if the girl could feel his gaze on her, the unspoken weight of memory pressing between them. The auburn-haired woman shifted, placing a hand lightly on the girl's shoulder, steadying her, claiming her, maybe warning her to hold silence. The girl nodded, eyes cast down. Still, Elias caught the shimmer there, a truth too fragile to be spoken aloud. Something moved in him then. Not trust, not yet, but something softer, a thread of recognition. He remembered the vow he had made when Clara was lost, that he would never again let another soul lean on him, never again open his door to grief he couldn't carry. And yet here she was, this trembling stranger, pulling that vow apart with nothing more than a shaking hand. The fire popped, scattering sparks. Outside, the storm roared on, relentless. Inside, Elias let his cup rest heavy in his lap. He no longer looked at the group as a faceless knot of secrets. He looked at them as people. Dangerous perhaps, but human all the same. The girl lifted her eyes just once, catching him watching. It wasn't long, no more than the blink of a moment, but it was enough. In her gaze, Elias saw fear, yes, but also a plea unspoken, a plea he knew too well. And in that instant, the wall of doubt inside him cracked. Not broken, not gone, but cracked enough for something else to slip through, something he hadn't felt in years. Mercy. Hoofbeats rang out in the rain. Their hunters had found the cabin. The storm had carried on so long it seemed the night would never lift. Rain drummed steady on the roof. Water slid down the window panes in crooked lines, and the wind pressed hard at the walls like a hand testing the strength of old bones. Elias sat still in his chair, eyes half on the fire, half on the women whose presence made the room tighter with each hour. Then he heard it, faint at first, buried beneath the storm's voice. A rhythm too sure, too measured to be thunder. Hoofbeats. His head tilted, listening. Once a lawman, always a listener. The sound came again, a beat of iron on soaked earth, many hooves together, muffled by rain but steady, too steady to belong to wild horses. He set his cup aside and stood, his boots pressing soft against the boards. The women felt it too. Shoulders stiffened, glances darted toward the door. The auburn-haired woman straightened, her hand brushing the folds of her damp dress where Elias already knew a weapon hid. The youngest pulled her shawl closer, as if cloth could guard against the weight pounding closer through the night. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The truth lay in their eyes, in the way fear spread without a sound. Whoever they had been running from had found their trail. Elias crossed to the porch lantern. He lifted it down, snuffed the flame with 2 fingers, and set it aside. Darkness pressed against the window at once, thick as wool. He slid the bolt tight across the door, the metal scraping low. For a long moment, he just stood there, one hand on the frame, listening as the hoofbeats drew nearer, then circled, then slowed. Shapes moved beyond the rain, shadows in motion, riders keeping low. The storm hadn't hidden them, it had only carried them this far. Elias turned back. The fire's glow painted every face sharp, restless. 7 women, all strangers, all secrets, gathered in his home because he had opened a door he had sworn would stay closed. He should have asked questions, should have demanded answers before the storm delivered them to his steps, but it was too late for that now. Instead, he walked to the window, set his boots firm, and stood where any bullet aimed inside would strike him first. He did not lift his rifle. He did not ask who those riders were. He only squared his shoulders against the glass and the night beyond, as if to say, "This is my land, this is my roof. Whatever comes, it will pass through me before it touches them." Behind him, the women sat silent, their breath shallow, their fear thick enough to taste. And for the first time in years, Elias Crow chose, not with words, not with trust, but with the simple act of standing, to take someone else's danger as his own. The hoofbeats circled once more in the dark, a low thunder rolling closer. Inside, no one moved, as if the whole house held its breath. All night long, they waited in silence, testing whether the house could hold against fear itself. The storm pressed on, wild and merciless, but Elias no longer heard only rain. He heard the riders moving out there in the dark, hooves sloshing through mud, the creak of leather, the low mutter of men whose voices carried just enough to betray their nearness. They didn't come hammering to the door. Not yet. They lingered, circling, like wolves waiting for weakness. Inside, the fire dropped to embers. Elias let it burn low, unwilling to give the riders a clear target through the windows. The cabin seemed to shrink as shadows thickened, its walls holding in more than the storm, holding in the tension of 7 women and 1 man caught in the same uneasy silence. No one asked Elias what he would do. No one explained who the men outside were. The questions lay heavy, unspoken, and perhaps that was mercy. Truth could wait. Survival could not. The auburn-haired woman moved close to the window once, her eyes sharp as glass. Elias lifted a hand. Not rough, not commanding, just steady enough to stop her where she stood. She froze, then stepped back, her jaw tight. He had seen enough chases to know, when prey stirs, predators close in faster. Stillness was the better shield. Hours crept. The wind pushed water through the cracks, wetting the floor. One of the women shivered, teeth clicking softly. Elias went to the cupboard and drew out the single spare quilt, coarse and patched, and laid it across her shoulders. She startled at the gesture, as if kindness weighed more than threat. She whispered a thank you that seemed to cost her more than silence had. The youngest, her hands still trembling from earlier, leaned against the wall, eyelids heavy. Elias watched her fight sleep. He knew that fight. He had done it himself on too many long nights, afraid to let his guard slip. Without a word, he nudged the chair beside his closer, as if to say she could rest if she dared. She sank into it, eyes closing at last, though her fingers never unclenched from her shawl. The hoofbeats faded, then returned. Once, someone outside laughed. A sharp, ugly sound carried through the storm. Elias's jaw hardened. He did not move for his rifle. Instead, he stayed by the door, arms folded, waiting with the patience the prairie had carved into him. Men out there could rage all they liked. The house would hold. And as the hours dragged toward dawn, something shifted. Fear didn't vanish, but it dulled, softened by the rhythm of rain and the steadiness of Elias's watch. The women breathed easier, some slumping into restless sleep, their shoulders less rigid than before. The cabin had turned from a stranger's shelter into something closer to a haven, at least for the night. Elias remained by the window, eyes on the dark. He had taken on their danger without their asking. He didn't know who they were or what debts followed them, but he knew this: no one would be taken from his land while he still stood. The hoofbeats lingered until the small hours, then began to fade. Whether the riders had lost heart or only planned to wait until morning, Elias could not know. He only knew that the night, long as it was, had been endured. And in enduring it together, in silence, in fear, in the shared burden of waiting, the cabin had become something it had not been in 8 years. It had become alive again. When morning broke, 7 riders rode away, leaving a man who was no longer alone. By the time the storm broke, the world felt scrubbed raw. The first light bled slow across the plains, gray giving way to pale gold, and the prairie, soaked and beaten through the night, rose steaming under the sun. The riders who had prowled the darkness were gone. No tracks remained in the churned mud, but the kind the rain itself had blurred away. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wool, wood smoke, and old coffee gone cold. The women stirred one by one, their faces worn thin, but softer than the night before. The youngest rubbed her eyes, startled, as if she'd dreamed herself into this place, and was ashamed to be caught still breathing. The auburn-haired woman rolled her cloak, tied it tight, and straightened with the steady poise of someone who had led too long to remember how not to. Elias opened the door. The hinges groaned. The wet earth gave up the night's breath, and sunlight slipped in across the floor. He stood on the threshold, hat in hand, the kind of gesture he hadn't made for years, half habit, half respect. Behind him, the women gathered their things with quiet purpose. No speeches were given, no questions asked. They knew better than to linger. A man who opened his door in a storm was already owed more than could ever be repaid. They stepped out onto the porch. one after another, faces turned into the morning, their silence carrying the weight of gratitude unspoken. Elias watched as they tightened cinches, mounted tired horses, and turned toward the road that cut west through the sodden grass. The youngest lingered a breath longer. She lifted her gaze, met his eyes, and in that fleeting look was everything words could never carry: fear, relief, and the barest trace of hope. Then she nudged her horse forward and joined the others. The hoofbeats that had come in the night returned now, but softer, receding into distance rather than pressing in with threat. Dust and mist rose from the wet ground, swallowing the riders until only the open plain remained. Elias stood on the porch long after they'd gone. His boots were soaked, his coat damp with the storm's last spit, but his chest felt lighter than it had in years. For 8 long seasons, he had guarded his solitude like a wound that would never close. And yet, one night, just one, had shown him that a door could still open, that a man's heart could still bend toward mercy without breaking. He looked at the lantern, its glass fogged with rain, wick blackened but waiting. Tonight, as every night, he would light it again. Only now he understood why. Not because he expected company, but because someone, somewhere, might be lost enough to need it. The prairie lay wide, washed clean, stretching toward horizons he no longer feared. Elias Crow stepped back inside, the morning sun following him across the floor. His cabin was no longer empty. It carried the breath of those who had passed through, and in its silence lingered a truth too plain to deny. No one walks this land forever alone.